The Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971. In 1971, Dr. Philip Zimbardo conducted one of the most infamous psychological experiments to study the effects of perceived power. Zimbardo designed a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building, selecting 24 college students to participate. The participants were randomly assigned to the role of either a guard or a prisoner. Imagine yourself as one of the students. You walk into the experiment with no idea what will unfold. It's just a simulation, after all. But soon, the lines between reality and role playing begin to blur. You, a college student, have been given the power to control other people. You're a guard now, and you begin to see the prisoners as less than human, following orders with increasing cruelty. On the other side, the prisoners feel completely helpless. They are stripped of their autonomy and forced into submission. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it was cut short after only 6 days. The guards started to behave more sadistically, using their power to intimidate and humiliate the prisoners. Some of the prisoners began showing signs of emotional distress, sobbing, nervous breakdowns, and a deep sense of hopelessness. What makes this experiment so shocking is how quickly the participants lost their sense of self. The power dynamics were so strong that the guards became aggressive and the prisoners became passive. They weren't just playing roles, they internalized them. Zimbardo himself, who played the role of the prison superintendent, was so immersed in the experiment that he failed to intervene when the situation got out of control. In one instance, a guard decided to take matters further by staging a mock trial for one of the prisoners, trying to humiliate him. Another guard went as far as to force the prisoners to perform degrading acts, and the prisoners, in turn, began to believe they deserved the punishment. The sense of authority and power was so overwhelming that even those who knew they were merely part of an experiment became trapped in their roles. Zimbardo's study revealed how easily human beings can fall into patterns of cruelty when given power. It's a sobering reminder of how situations and environments can drastically influence behavior. As we reflect on this, consider how you react when placed in a position of authority. The Stanford Prison Experiment shows that power can corrupt. Even the most well meaning individuals can be swayed by their circumstances. The Milgram Obedience Study, 1961. The Milgram Obedience Study, conducted by Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s, sought to understand the extent to which individuals would obey authority figures, even when asked to harm others. It was inspired by the atrocities committed during World War II and questioned whether ordinary people could commit inhumane acts under the influence of authority. The experiment took place in a laboratory at Yale University. The participant was told they were part of a study on memory and learning. They were assigned to the role of teacher, while the other participant, who was actually an actor, played the role of learner. The teacher was instructed to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to the learner every time they gave an incorrect answer. The shocks ranged from 15 volts to a maximum of 450 volts, labeled danger, severe shock. At first, the learner answered the questions incorrectly, and the teacher administered mild shocks. The learners' protests began to increase, and soon they were screaming in pain. Yet, when the teacher hesitated, the experimenter, an authoritative figure, encouraged them to continue, stating, "The experiment requires that you continue." The most disturbing part, despite hearing the learner's pleas, over 60% of participants continued to administer shocks up to the maximum 450-volt level, even after the learner stopped responding. Some of them were visibly distressed, yet they still obeyed the authority figure, fearing consequences if they didn't. What does this experiment reveal about human nature? It suggests that when people are placed under the authority of an expert or a figure of power, they tend to follow instructions, even when those instructions conflict with their moral compass. The Milgram experiment demonstrates the power of authority in overriding personal ethics. Think about this. Have you ever followed an order that went against your values because of who gave it? Milgram's study shows how often people are willing to relinquish personal responsibility when told to obey. It's a chilling reminder of how obedience to authority can lead to actions that seem unthinkable in the absence of authority. The Little Albert Experiment, 1920. The Little Albert Experiment, conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner in 1920, is one of the most well-known studies in psychology, yet it is also one of the most ethically controversial. Watson, a leading figure in behaviorism, wanted to demonstrate that emotional responses, like fear, could be conditioned into humans. The experiment involved a young child named Albert, who was only 9 months old at the time. Albert was shown a variety of stimuli, including a white rat, a rabbit, and a monkey. Initially, Albert showed no fear of these objects, but then Watson and Rayner began pairing the presence of the white rat with a loud, frightening noise, striking a steel bar with a hammer every time Albert touched the rat. This sudden noise caused Albert to cry out in fear. After several pairings of the rat and the loud noise, Albert began to show signs of distress simply upon seeing the rat, even without the noise. His fear had been conditioned, but the experiment didn't stop there. Albert's fear generalized to other furry objects. He cried and recoiled, not just at the rat, but at a rabbit, a dog, and even a fur coat. What makes this experiment so unsettling is the ethical implications. Watson and Rayner had conditioned a young child to fear harmless objects, and there was no attempt to reverse the conditioned fear afterward. Little Albert was left traumatized, his emotional response permanently altered by the experiment. The experiment's results have sparked a great deal of debate, but it's undeniable that it helped establish the foundation for behavioral psychology, which focuses on the role of conditioning in shaping human behavior. The Little Albert experiment demonstrates just how powerful the process of conditioning can be. It shows how fear can be learned and how our emotional responses can be manipulated. But it also raises important ethical questions about the responsibility of researchers in safeguarding their subjects' well being. The Bobo Doll Experiment, 1961. The Bobo Doll Experiment, conducted by Albert Bandura in 1961, focused on observational learning and aggression. Bandura wanted to understand how children would imitate violent behavior if they witnessed it. This study is one of the cornerstones of Bandura's social learning theory, which suggests that we learn through observing others. In the experiment, children were shown a video of an adult acting aggressively towards an inflatable Bobo doll. The adult would punch the doll, kick it, and even yell at it. After watching this, the children were placed in a room with a Bobo doll. The result was startling. The children who had observed the aggressive behavior were much more likely to imitate it. They kicked the doll, hit it with a mallet, and even used some of the same phrases they had heard the adult use, like sock him in the nose. What's fascinating about this experiment is that Bandura showed that children didn't need to be directly rewarded or punished for their actions. They simply learned through observation. This introduced the concept of modeling, where behavior is learned by watching others. But the experiment also highlighted how easily children can imitate aggressive behavior. It led to the conclusion that exposure to violence, even in the form of play or entertainment, can result in increased aggression in children. This finding has been used to argue against violent media content, as it suggests that children may internalize aggressive actions and replicate them in real life. The Monster Study, 1939. In 1939, Dr. Wendell Johnson, a psychologist at the University of Iowa, conducted an experiment that would come to be known as the Monster Study. The goal of this experiment was to understand the causes of stuttering and whether it could be conditioned into children. However, the method of the experiment would later come under heavy scrutiny due to its ethical implications. Johnson and his team selected 22 orphaned children for the study, some of whom already had speech issues, and others who had normal speech development. These children were divided into two groups. The first group was subjected to positive reinforcement. They were praised for their speech, even when they stuttered. The second group, however, was given negative reinforcement. They were criticized for even minor speech imperfections, being labeled as stutterers and failures for the slightest hesitation. Imagine being one of those children. You're a young person, just learning to communicate, and instead of encouragement, you're told over and over that you're incapable, that your speech is wrong. Some of these children, who had previously spoken without issue, began to develop speech difficulties. The harsh criticism and negative feedback seemed to bring on the stuttering. Meanwhile, the children in the other group, who were praised for their speech, showed little to no signs of stuttering. This experiment's most unsettling aspect is that it did not just study stuttering, it created it. The children who were subjected to negative feedback developed emotional distress, anxiety, and long-lasting psychological damage. Some of the children continued to struggle with speech issues well into adulthood, far beyond the duration of the experiment. The Monster Study shows us just how powerful words can be. When we criticize or label someone, especially during vulnerable stages of their development, it can shape their self-esteem and even their identity. This experiment is a reminder of the power of reinforcement, whether positive or negative, and how it can shape the behaviors of those around us. It demonstrates that the impact of our words can stretch far beyond the moment. The CIA's MK Ultra project, 1950s and 1970s. The MK Ultra project is one of the darkest and most controversial chapters in the history of psychological experimentation. For nearly 2 decades, Beginning in the 1950s, the CIA conducted covert operations to develop mind control techniques. The aim was to determine how psychological manipulation could be used to control the behavior of individuals, often without their consent. What's most chilling about MK Ultra is that it wasn't just about understanding the mind, it was about exploiting it. The CIA used drugs, hypnosis, and other psychological techniques on unwitting individuals, many of whom had no idea they were part of an experiment. One of the key elements of MK Ultra was the use of LSD. The CIA administered the drug to subjects without their knowledge, hoping to observe how it affected their mental state and if it could be used as a tool for interrogation or mind control. Imagine being one of the test subjects. You're told you're participating in a research study, but you don't know that the substances you're being given are not just harmless pills or liquids, they are powerful hallucinogens designed to alter your mind and perceptions. Some individuals were subjected to days of drug induced experiments, leading to long term psychological harm. The goal was to break down the subject's willpower, but in many cases, the trauma that resulted was irreversible. This project also explored the use of sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture techniques, which were aimed at manipulating the mind into a state where it could be more easily controlled. It's horrifying to think that these individuals were often chosen because they were vulnerable. Some were mental patients, prostitutes, or military personnel, and they were treated as little more than human guinea pigs in the name of experimentation. MK Ultra remains controversial because it shows just how far those in power will go to achieve their goals. The disregard for personal autonomy and the mental well being of others is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority. This dark chapter in psychological experimentation is a sobering reflection of the lengths some will go to for control, manipulation, and power. The Landis Facial Expression Experiment, 1924. In 1924, psychologist Carl Landis conducted a controversial study on facial expressions to understand whether certain emotions universally produce similar facial reactions across different cultures. Landis believed that facial expressions were essential for understanding emotional states, but his methods of studying these reactions would raise ethical concerns that still echo today. The experiment itself involved asking participants to engage in a variety of situations designed to elicit strong emotional responses. These scenarios were meant to provoke fear, joy, surprise, and disgust in an effort to observe the universal nature of emotional expressions. However, the most unsettling part of the experiment came with the use of extreme methods to elicit these expressions. One of the most famous and controversial aspects of the Landis study involved his participants being asked to stick their hands into a box that contained a live rat. The idea was to provoke a response of fear or disgust by forcing the participants to interact with the rodent. The reactions were then analyzed for the universal facial expressions they elicited. But Landis didn't stop there. In some instances, participants were asked to gaze at disturbing or shocking images, like mutilated animals or unsettling visual stimuli, to see how their faces would react. What's disturbing is that Landis would often keep participants in these emotionally intense situations for extended periods of time, disregarding their discomfort. The focus was entirely on the facial expression, with little regard for the emotional trauma these participants may have been experiencing. The Landis facial expression experiment shows us that emotions, while universal, are not without complexity. It also reveals that when researchers prioritize their data collection over the well being of the participants, the results can be ethically problematic. These experiments remind us of the responsibility that researchers have in respecting their subjects and considering the long term psychological effects of their actions. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. One of the most shocking and unethical studies in medical history is the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, which began in 1932 and continued for 40 years. The study, conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service, aimed to observe the progression of untreated syphilis in African American men. But what makes this study so disturbing is that the participants were never informed about the true nature of the experiment, and they were denied treatment for the disease even after penicillin became a widely known and effective cure. The participants, many of whom were poor sharecroppers from rural Alabama, were told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague term used to describe a variety of ailments. They were promised free health care, meals, and transportation to the study site. But what they were not told was that they were part of an experiment that would observe their syphilis without providing them with any real treatment. As the years went on, the researchers continued to observe the progression of the disease, even as the men became severely ill and died from complications. The researchers withheld penicillin, the standard treatment for syphilis, despite knowing it would cure the disease. What makes this study even more appalling is that the participants were never informed of their condition, and many did not understand the long term consequences of their involvement. This unethical research led to severe consequences, not only for the men involved, but also for their families. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study became a symbol of medical exploitation, particularly the way marginalized groups were subjected to experimentation without their consent. It wasn't until 1972, when the study was publicly exposed, that it was finally ended and the survivors received compensation. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study is a reminder of the importance of informed consent, respect for participants, and the duty to protect the well being of those who are vulnerable. It's a story of how trust was violated on a massive scale, and it has forever changed how ethical guidelines are enforced in medical research. The Robbers Cave Experiment. In 1954, Muzaffar Sharif and his colleagues conducted an experiment at a summer camp called Robbers Cave in Oklahoma. This study was designed to explore how intergroup conflict and cooperation could arise under controlled conditions. The experiment involved two groups of boys, each unaware of the other's existence at the start. The children were all around the same age and came from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, ensuring that the groups had no pre existing biases. At first, the groups were kept separate, and each group developed its own identity. They named themselves Rattlers and Eagles, and they bonded over shared activities, becoming increasingly close knit. They participated in team building exercises, forming friendships and creating in group norms. But soon, the researchers introduced competitive activities, sports, games, and challenges designed to foster rivalry between the two groups. As expected, the competition turned hostile. The boys began to exhibit extreme behaviors, verbal abuse, physical aggression, and even acts of sabotage. What started as friendly rivalry quickly escalated into full blown conflict. The researchers noticed that even small, trivial differences between the groups became magnified in the context of competition. Then, the researchers introduced tasks that required cooperation between the two groups, shared goals like fixing a broken water supply, and pooling their resources for a common objective. Slowly, as the boys worked together to achieve these goals, their hostility diminished and cooperation took hold. By the end of the experiment, the two groups had formed alliances, shared meals, and even supported one another. What does this tell us about human nature? The Robbers Cave experiment demonstrates the powerful forces of in group and out group bias and how quickly competition can turn into conflict. But it also shows that cooperation and shared goals can break down barriers, leading to peaceful interactions. It reminds us that our divisions often stem from perceived differences, but through understanding and working together, these barriers can be overcome. The Willowbrook State School Experiment, 1950s, 1970s. In the mid 20th century, the world was beginning to emerge from the shadows of war and uncertainty. A sense of progress was in the air. Medicine was advancing, science was uncovering new mysteries of the human body, and hope for a better future was bright. But even in times of great progress, there were dark chapters in history, stories that remind us of the importance of ethics and compassion in our pursuit of knowledge. One such story took place in a quiet corner of Staten Island, New York, in an institution known as Willowbrook State School. The Willowbrook State School, which first opened in the 1930s, was a large facility built to house and care for children with intellectual disabilities. For decades, this institution was seen as a necessary place of care for children who could not live in mainstream society. Over time, however, the facility became a symbol of neglect and overcrowding. By the 1950s and 1960s, it had become notorious for its poor living conditions. With hundreds of children living in small, cramped quarters, the school's infrastructure was stretched far beyond its limits. The children, already facing the challenges of their disabilities, also had to endure unsanitary, unsafe living environments. It was during this difficult time, amidst the frustration and hardship faced by these children and their families, that a troubling experiment was set in motion. Dr. Sol Krugman, a medical researcher who had a deep interest in understanding infectious diseases, was appointed to conduct research on the transmissions of hepatitis. At the time, hepatitis was a mysterious disease. Doctors knew it affected the liver, but they didn't fully understand how it spread or how to prevent it. Hepatitis was a silent, often deadly infection, and it was spreading more widely in parts of the United States, particularly in institutions where many people lived in close quarters. Dr. Krugman, along with his team, decided that the best way to study the progression of hepatitis and its potential vaccines would be to infect healthy children and observe how the disease developed. The children at Willowbrook, already living in the institution for care, became the subjects of this unsettling research. These children were considered to be at high risk for hepatitis, not only because of the overcrowded conditions of the institution, but also due to their weakened immune systems. It was thought that by deliberately infecting them, the researchers could gain insight into the disease and, eventually, develop a vaccine that would save lives in the future. However, what began as a seemingly logical medical study quickly turned into something far more ethically complex. The parents of the children were told that their children were participating in a medical study, one that could improve the future of medical treatments and help children just like theirs. They were told that this research could help save lives, though they were not fully informed of the risks involved. They were not told that their children would be deliberately injected with the hepatitis virus, that their health would be put at serious risk for the sake of medical knowledge. The children, some as young as 3 years old, were injected with the virus. They were exposed to a dangerous disease without their consent, without the ability to understand the consequences. And while the researchers carefully monitored the progression of the disease in these children, the true cost of the experiment became more and more evident. The children who were infected with hepatitis often experienced severe symptoms. Some developed high fevers, painful jaundice, and an array of other debilitating symptoms. As their bodies struggled to fight off the virus, their liver function was severely compromised. For some, the effects of the virus would be lifelong. The researchers observed these children, taking notes on every detail of their suffering in the hopes that it would lead to breakthroughs in understanding the disease. But while the study may have contributed to advancements in hepatitis research, it came at an unimaginable personal cost. The children who survived the experiment often faced long-term physical health problems. Some experienced permanent liver damage, and many suffered from ongoing emotional and psychological trauma. They had been used as tools in an experiment they did not understand, and many carried the scars of that treatment for the rest of their lives. What makes this story so difficult to comprehend is the absence of informed consent. The children who were involved in the study were not capable of understanding what was happening to them, nor were they able to give consent. Consent is a fundamental principle in medical ethics, a principle that requires patients to fully understand the potential risks and benefits of a procedure before agreeing to it. But for the children at Willowbrook, consent was never obtained. Their parents, though told about the study, were not fully informed of its potential dangers. They were led to believe that their children would be helping to advance medical research, but they were not told about the suffering their children would endure. As the years went on, the conditions at Willowbrook State School only worsened. The overcrowding and poor treatment continued to plague the institution, and the children who were subjected to the hepatitis experiment were left with lasting consequences. Many of the children who survived the study experienced ongoing medical issues, and their families were left to deal with the emotional and financial burden of the experiment for years to come. The story of the Willowbrook experiment is a powerful reminder of the vulnerability of certain groups within society. It highlights the need for ethical standards in medical research, particularly when it comes to vulnerable populations like children, the disabled, and those who cannot advocate for themselves. While the researchers at Willowbrook may have believed they were acting in the interest of scientific progress, they ignored the fundamental rights and dignity of the children involved. They failed to recognize that human lives are not tools for research, but individuals with inherent value, deserving of respect and protection. It is important to understand that while the experiment led to advancements in hepatitis research, those advancements came at an immense moral cost. The question we must ask ourselves is whether scientific progress is truly worth pursuing if it comes at the expense of human dignity. Can we truly claim to have made progress if that progress is built on the suffering of those who cannot defend themselves? The Willowbrook experiment serves as a painful lesson in the need for ethical standards in medical research. It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge should never come at the expense of compassion and respect for human life. It calls for us to remember that, no matter how important the research may seem, we must always prioritize the well-being of those involved. In the years following the closure of Willowbrook in 1987, much attention was drawn to the injustice of the experiment and the need for stronger protections for vulnerable individuals in medical studies became a priority. The outrage over what happened at Willowbrook helped to lead to reforms in the way that medical research is conducted, and the case is often cited as a powerful example of what can happen when ethical standards are ignored. As we reflect on the story of Willowbrook, we are reminded of the need for vigilance in protecting the rights of all people, especially those who are most vulnerable. We must always ask ourselves whether the pursuit of knowledge is being done in a way that honors the dignity and humanity of those who are part of the study. And, perhaps most importantly, we must remember that the value of a human life is never something that can be measured by the potential for scientific discovery. It is, and will always be, immeasurable and irreplaceable. The Aversion Project, 1970s, 1980s. In the heart of South Africa, during the tense and tumultuous era of apartheid in the 1970s and 1980s, a deeply disturbing and unethical series of experiments unfolded. Known as the Aversion Project, it was a dark chapter in the history of psychological research where the lives of many vulnerable men were altered forever. This project was driven by the apartheid government's oppressive desire to correct what they deemed to be deviations from their narrow views of society, particularly when it came to matters of sexuality. At its core, the Aversion Project aimed to change the sexual orientation of individuals. Homosexuality, under the apartheid regime, was viewed not just as immoral, but as something that needed to be eradicated. The government's stance on homosexuality was clear: it was wrong, and it needed to be fixed. And so, in an attempt to treat homosexual individuals, the Aversion Project was born. The therapy involved was based on a form of psychological conditioning known as aversion therapy. It was intended to change a person's emotional response to a particular stimulus, in this case, same-sex attraction, by associating it with painful or uncomfortable stimuli. This deeply invasive therapy involved a mix of harsh methods: electroshock therapy, which caused excruciating pain, along with nausea-inducing drugs designed to create strong physical discomfort. These men, Many young soldiers and military personnel, though some were also civilians, were told they had a problem that needed fixing. They were subjected to treatments that forced them to associate their sexual orientation with distress, shame, and fear. The therapy was positioned as a means of medical correction, a way to cure their homosexuality. But these men were never given full information, nor were they truly informed of the risks or the suffering they would endure. What makes this experiment so profoundly upsetting is the total disregard for consent. These young men were often coerced or manipulated into undergoing these cruel treatments. They did not have the freedom to choose their path, nor were they empowered to voice their objections. The absence of informed consent is a glaring violation of their autonomy, one that left them vulnerable to both physical harm and lasting emotional trauma. They were told they had a problem that needed to be fixed, and so they were subjected to a process that stripped away their dignity, their agency, and their sense of self worth. The effects of the aversion project were devastating. Men who survived the shock treatments often carried the weight of emotional scars that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The pain inflicted during the sessions was only the beginning of the suffering. Many participants found themselves caught in a cycle of guilt, shame, and confusion, torn between their true selves and the distorted reality forced upon them by the therapy. The treatments aimed not just to change their behavior, but to break their spirits, to erase their identities. But despite the oppressive nature of these treatments, the resilience of the human spirit is remarkable. Over time, some of the men who had been subjected to the aversion project began to speak out. They came forward with their stories, exposing the horrors of the experiment and the lasting damage it had caused. Their courage to share their experiences became a beacon of truth, shining light on one of the darkest periods in psychological history. The Aversion Project serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and prejudice. It highlights the importance of respecting the autonomy of individuals and upholding ethical standards in psychological research. When science is used as a tool of control rather than care, the consequences can be catastrophic. The project was not only an attack on personal identity, but also a violation of fundamental human rights. The legacy of the Aversion Project is a painful one, but it also serves as a turning point in the fight for human dignity. It underscores the importance of informed consent, compassion, and respect for all people, regardless of their sexual orientation. The shameful practices of the past have paved the way for stronger protections and ethical guidelines in modern psychological research. Today, we are more aware of the need for respect and care in our treatment of others and for the protection of vulnerable populations from harm. The Aversion Project was a stark reminder of how deeply societal prejudice can warp our perception of others, turning something as beautiful as love into something to be feared and punished. Yet, it also serves as a testament to the resilience of those who endure such suffering and the importance of ensuring that we never repeat such mistakes. It's crucial that we learn from these dark chapters in history. By remembering the victims of the Aversion Project and the suffering they endured, we are reminded of the importance of standing up against injustice, advocating for human dignity, and ensuring that psychological research is conducted with the utmost care and respect for all people. The Nazi medical experiments. During World War II, under the direction of the Nazi regime, numerous medical experiments were conducted on prisoners in concentration camps. These experiments were intended to further the goals of Nazi ideology and eugenics, but they were carried out without any regard for human life, dignity, or ethical standards. The most notorious of these experiments were performed at Auschwitz and other camps where individuals, mostly Jews, Romani people, and other marginalized groups, were subjected to horrific procedures. One of the most infamous experiments was the study of hypothermia. Prisoners were placed in freezing cold water or exposed to freezing temperatures to determine how long it would take for them to die. Others were subjected to experiments involving high altitude pressure, in which they were placed in pressure chambers to simulate the effects of high altitude flight, causing many to suffer from severe physiological distress. In addition to these physical experiments, prisoners were also subjected to gruesome medical procedures, including the forced sterilization of women, as part of Nazi attempts to eliminate what they considered undesirable genetic traits. The suffering endured by these victims is incomprehensible, and many died as a result of these experiments, while others were left with permanent physical and mental scars. These experiments were a direct violation of basic human rights and ethical principles, and they serve as one of the darkest examples of scientific abuse in history. The lack of consent, the torture inflicted on innocent people, and the sheer disregard for life highlight the capacity for cruelty in the name of science. The legacy of these experiments serves as a painful reminder of the importance of ethics in medical research. It also reinforces the need for accountability, especially in times of war or political unrest, to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. The placebo effect and nocebo effect, psychological manipulation and health. The placebo effect is one of the most fascinating and mysterious phenomena in medical psychology. It demonstrates the power of the mind to influence the body, where individuals experience real physical changes in their condition after receiving a treatment that has no therapeutic effect. Simply put, when a person believes they are receiving an effective treatment, their body may respond as though it is actually working, even if the treatment is nothing more than a sugar pill or saline solution. But what is even more unsettling is the nocebo effect, the darker twin of the placebo effect. While the placebo effect occurs when positive expectations lead to improvement, the nocebo effect occurs when negative expectations produce negative outcomes. If someone is convinced that a harmless substance will make them feel worse or cause harm, their belief can trigger physical symptoms such as nausea, fatigue, or pain. In fact, the mere belief that a treatment might cause side effects can be enough to make those side effects manifest in the body. This effect was studied in clinical trials where patients who were given placebos still experienced adverse effects simply because they anticipated them. This can even happen with medications. Individuals who are told that a drug has serious side effects are more likely to experience those side effects, even when the drug they take is inert. What makes this phenomenon so compelling is the sheer power of the mind in influencing the body. It shows that our thoughts, expectations, and beliefs can have real physical consequences. The placebo effect demonstrates how deeply intertwined the mind and body are, and how mental states can influence not just how we feel, but our physical health. The nocebo effect, however, reveals a darker side of this influence. It shows that negative thinking or expectations can not only worsen our conditions, but can also create entirely new symptoms. This has profound implications for how we view our own health. It's a reminder that the mind can be both a powerful force for healing and a force that can cause harm. As you reflect on this, think about your own beliefs. How often do you anticipate negative outcomes, and how might those expectations influence your physical state? It's fascinating and sobering to think about how much power we have in shaping our own health simply through our thoughts and beliefs. Framing effects, psychological manipulation of perception. Framing is a psychological concept that reveals just how easily our perceptions and decisions can be manipulated by the way information is presented to us. At its core, the framing effect suggests that the way something is framed, how it is described or presented, can dramatically affect our response, even if the facts themselves remain unchanged. One of the most striking examples of the framing effect comes from a study in which participants were told to choose between two different medical procedures for the same condition. One procedure was described as having a 90% success rate, while the other was described as having a 10% failure rate. Despite the two statements conveying the exact same information, people overwhelmingly chose the procedure with the 90% success rate because it was framed positively. This happens because the human brain is wired to react more strongly to positive framing rather than negative framing, even if the underlying data is the same. This effect is used extensively in media, marketing, politics, and everyday interactions to influence decisions, shape opinions, and even control behavior. In political campaigns, for example, a policy might be framed as a job creation initiative to elicit positive reactions, or as wasteful government spending to elicit negative reactions, depending on the agenda of those presenting the information. The way an issue is framed can shape how people perceive it, regardless of the facts. Similarly, advertisements often frame products as solutions to problems, influencing consumers to make purchases they may not have otherwise considered. The framing effect works because it taps into our cognitive biases, our brain's natural tendency to rely on shortcuts when processing information. We prefer simplicity and are more likely to accept information that is framed in a way that aligns with our desires or expectations. What does this tell us about our decision making? It shows that we are not as rational as we often think. Our perceptions can be easily swayed by how information is presented, making it vital for us to critically examine the framing of the messages we receive. In our everyday lives, we may be influenced by the framing of news stories, advertisements, or even the way people present information to us. Being aware of the framing effect allows us to take a step back and make decisions based on the facts rather than the way those facts are framed. The Ask Conformity Experiment in 1951, Solomon Asch conducted a groundbreaking experiment to explore the extent to which social pressure could influence individuals to conform even when they knew the group's consensus was wrong. The Ash conformity experiment is often regarded as one of the most striking demonstrations of group influence in psychology. In this experiment, participants were placed in a group with several Confederates, people who were in on the experiment. They were shown a series of lines and asked to identify which line was the same length as a reference line. The correct answer was obvious, but the Confederates were instructed to give incorrect answers on purpose. The real participant, who was unaware of the Confederates' roles, was placed last in the group and asked for their response after hearing everyone else's answers. Ash found that a significant number of participants, approximately 32%, conformed to the incorrect group answer at least once, even when they knew the group's response was wrong. In some cases, participants would go against their own perception and agree with the group, even when the discrepancy was glaring. The pressure to conform was so strong that it influenced their decisions, causing them to doubt their own perceptions. What does this experiment reveal about human behavior? It shows the immense power of social pressure and how it can alter even the most confident individual's decision making. People are social creatures, and the desire to fit in with a group can override personal beliefs and judgments. Ash's experiment suggests that our need to belong and be accepted by others can be so strong that it leads us to conform to opinions and actions that go against our better judgment. This experiment is particularly relevant in today's world of social media, where people are often influenced by the opinions of others, whether it's about trends, beliefs, or actions. The Ash conformity experiment serves as a reminder to reflect on our decisions and to be aware of the pressure we may feel to conform to the crowd, especially when it goes against our own values or better judgment. The Harlow's monkeys experiment, one of the most well-known and controversial experiments in the history of psychology, is the study of attachment conducted by Harry Harlow in the 1950s and 1960s. Harlow studied infant rhesus monkeys to explore the nature of attachment and bonding, and his work uncovered profound insights into the psychological need for love and affection. In his experiment, Harlow separated infant monkeys from their mothers shortly after birth and placed them with two surrogate mothers, one made of wire and the other covered in soft cloth. The wire mother provided food, while the cloth mother offered comfort and warmth. The monkeys were given the choice of which surrogate to spend time with, and the results were startling. Harlow found that the monkeys consistently preferred the cloth mother, spending the majority of their time clinging to her, even though she did not provide food. This behavior demonstrated the importance of comfort and emotional security in the development of attachment, overriding the need for nourishment. In another part of the experiment, Harlow subjected the infant monkeys to stressful situations, such as introducing them to a frightening toy. The monkeys would immediately seek comfort from the cloth mother, illustrating the vital role of affection in emotional regulation. What makes this experiment so disturbing, however, is the methods Harlow used. The monkeys were subjected to extreme isolation, and some were raised without any maternal contact at all. Many of these monkeys later displayed signs of severe psychological distress, including social withdrawal and violent behavior, highlighting the long term consequences of emotional neglect. The Harlow's Monkeys experiment emphasizes the importance of nurturing relationships and emotional bonds in early development. It shows that love and affection are not just luxuries, they are essential for mental and emotional well being. While Harlow's work provided valuable insights into human attachment, it also raises ethical questions about the treatment of animals in research and the lasting psychological damage caused by such isolation. The Lost in the Mall experiment in 1995, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus conducted an experiment that highlighted the malleability of human memory. Known as the Lost in the Mall experiment, it demonstrated how easily false memories can be implanted even in the most vivid and seemingly accurate recollections. The premise of the experiment was to investigate the creation of false memories through suggestion. Loftus and her colleagues took advantage of family memories. Specifically, they asked participants to recall specific events from their childhood, events that their parents had written down for them beforehand. Among these true memories, the researchers inserted a fabricated one, the memory of being lost in a mall at a young age, a traumatic event that never actually occurred. Despite the fact that the event had never happened, many of the participants began to remember the fabricated memory vividly. They described being scared, lost, and even found by a stranger, all of which were entirely made up. This experiment revealed the profound impact suggestion can have on memory. People, even when they're convinced of a false memory, can recall details and emotions surrounding the event as if it truly happened. The Lost in the Mall experiment has significant implications for the legal field, particularly in relation to eyewitness testimony. If our memories are so susceptible to distortion, how can we trust the recollections of witnesses in a court of law? This study serves as a reminder that memory is not a perfect recording of the past, but rather a reconstruction that can be influenced by external factors, biases, and suggestions. What does this teach us about ourselves? It shows just how fragile memory can be. Even our most vivid recollections can be altered or manipulated, making us question the reliability of our own minds. As you reflect on this, consider the nature of your own memories. How often do we rely on what we remember as the truth only to find out later that our minds can deceive us? And the cognitive dissonance experiment. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological phenomenon that occurs when we experience conflicting beliefs or attitudes, leading to a feeling of discomfort. In 1957, psychologist Leon Festinger conducted a groundbreaking experiment to understand how people deal with this inner tension. Festinger's study focused on a group of people who had strong beliefs in a specific doomsday prophecy. According to the prophecy, the world was going to end on a particular date, and the group had prepared for this event, believing it with their whole hearts. When the predicted day came and went without any catastrophic event, the believers were faced with a major cognitive dissonance. Their beliefs had been proven wrong, yet they could not simply abandon the ideas they had held on to for so long. Festinger observed how the group members responded to this dissonance. Rather than abandon their beliefs or accept the failure of the prophecy, Many of them doubled down. They justified their beliefs by claiming that their faith in the prophecy had caused the world to be saved, and that the lack of a catastrophe was proof of their power. They found new ways to rationalize the failure rather than accept that they had been wrong. This experiment demonstrates the power of cognitive dissonance in shaping our behavior and beliefs. It reveals that when our core beliefs are challenged, rather than change our minds, we often seek ways to reduce the discomfort caused by the contradiction. People will go to great lengths to maintain internal consistency, even if it means distorting reality to fit their pre existing views. What's unsettling about cognitive dissonance is that it helps explain why people often defend flawed beliefs, refuse to change their minds, and resist new information that contradicts their worldview. It's a natural defense mechanism, but it can also prevent growth and learning. The cognitive dissonance experiment reminds us of the importance of self awareness and the ability to accept uncomfortable truths, even when it means confronting our own biases. The Good Samaritan experiment in 1973, psychologists John Darley and Daniel Batson set out to understand the factors that influence whether people will help others in need. Their experiment, known as the Good Samaritan experiment, was based on the biblical story of the Good Samaritan, which teaches the importance of helping others, even strangers, in times of need. The experiment was set up by having seminary students at Princeton University take part in a study. They were asked to walk across campus to give a talk about either religious topics or work related subjects. Along the way, a person, a Confederate in the study, would pretend to be in need of help, slumped over and coughing, clearly distressed. What made this study so interesting was that the researchers manipulated the amount of time the students thought they had before their talk. Some were told they were running late, while others had ample time to arrive. The results were striking. The students who were told they had plenty of time were more likely to stop and help the distressed individual. However, those who believed they were late for their talk rarely stopped to help. This experiment demonstrated that people's willingness to help others is often influenced by situational factors, such as time pressure, rather than by moral or ethical considerations. Even when the participants were religious seminarians, many of them chose not to help simply because they were preoccupied with their own schedules. The study revealed that good intentions alone were not enough to guarantee that someone would act compassionately. It also depended on the circumstances. What does this teach us about human nature? It shows that helping others is not always a simple, straightforward decision. We often overlook the needs of others because we're focused on our own concerns or busy lives. The Good Samaritan experiment is a reminder to check our own priorities and consider the well being of others, even when life feels rushed or overwhelming. It calls us to pause and ask, how often do we overlook the suffering of others because we're too preoccupied with our own needs? The Crazy Experiment, Psychiatric Hospital Simulation. One of the most disturbing psychological experiments in the history of mental health is the Crazy Experiment, also known as the Rosenhan Experiment, conducted by psychologist David Rosenhan in 1973. The aim of the experiment was to investigate the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses and to explore the experiences of people within psychiatric hospitals. Rosenhan and his colleagues sent 8 pseudo-patients, people who were mentally healthy, into psychiatric hospitals where they pretended to hear voices. All the pseudo-patients were admitted, and they were diagnosed with various psychiatric disorders, even though they had no actual mental illness. While inside, the pseudo-patients behaved normally, yet none of the staff identified them as imposters. They were all treated as genuine patients, and their normal behavior was misinterpreted as part of their psychiatric conditions. The most disturbing part of the study was the way the staff in the psychiatric hospitals were unable to distinguish between real patients and imposters, even after observing them for extended periods. The experiment demonstrated the power of labeling and how mental health professionals could overlook normal behavior, especially when it was framed within the context of a psychiatric diagnosis. The Rosenhan experiment revealed how flawed psychiatric diagnoses can be, and how people, once labeled with a mental illness, are often treated differently, regardless of their actual condition. It showed that once a person is categorized as mentally ill, their actions and behaviors are automatically interpreted through that lens, regardless of reality. This experiment raises important ethical questions about the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses and the stigma attached to mental illness. It also highlights the dehumanizing effects of psychiatric hospitals and the difficulty of escaping from a label once it's been applied. It serves as a reminder to be cautious about making judgments based on labels and to always seek a deeper understanding of people's experiences. The halo effect. The halo effect is a psychological phenomenon where our overall impression of a person influences how we perceive their specific traits or behaviors. This effect is often unconscious and happens when a person's positive or negative qualities influence our judgment of their other unrelated characteristics. The term halo effect was coined by psychologist Edward Thorndike in the 1920s, but it gained more prominence in the 1970s as researchers began to explore its impact on daily life. Imagine meeting someone for the first time. Perhaps they're attractive, charismatic, or confident. These positive traits may automatically lead you to believe that they're also kind, intelligent, and competent, even if you have no evidence to support those assumptions. Conversely, if a person seems unfriendly or unattractive, we might automatically assume they lack other positive qualities. The halo effect skews our perception, causing us to overlook flaws or exaggerate strengths based on our initial judgment. One of the most famous experiments demonstrating the halo effect involved students who were asked to rate a professor after watching a short video of them. When the professor displayed warmth and friendliness, students rated their teaching abilities much higher than when the professor came across as cold or aloof, even though the content of the lesson was identical. This bias doesn't just apply to individuals. The halo effect is a powerful tool in marketing and advertising as well. Brands often use attractive spokespeople or celebrities to promote their products because consumers are likely to associate the product with the positive traits of the spokesperson. Similarly, politicians use their public persona to influence how people view their policies, even if their actions don't match the image they project. The halo effect is a reminder of how easily we are swayed by our initial impressions and how those impressions can shape our beliefs and decisions without us even realizing it. It's a call to be more mindful of our biases and to try to assess people and situations more objectively without letting a single positive or negative trait cloud our judgment. The Little Peter Experiment, Counter Conditioning. In the 1920s, John B. Watson, the father of behaviorism, conducted one of the most famous psychological experiments of the time with a young child named Little Peter. Watson's goal was to study counter conditioning, a psychological technique in which a person's negative response to a stimulus is replaced with a positive one. Specifically, Watson wanted to see if it was possible to eliminate a child's fear through conditioning and replace it with a positive emotional response. Little Peter, a toddler, had an intense fear of white rabbits. Watson and his assistant, Rosalie Rayner, began by presenting the rabbit to Peter at a distance, allowing him to observe the creature without immediate fear. Over time, they paired the sight of the rabbit with pleasant stimuli like food or toys, ensuring that Peter began to associate the rabbit with these pleasant experiences. What's fascinating about the experiment is that, after several weeks of this gradual exposure and positive association, Peter's fear of the rabbit diminished, and he was able to play with it without showing any distress. The experiment was groundbreaking in showing how emotional responses could be conditioned and, more importantly, changed through carefully managed, controlled experiences. However, there are ethical concerns around the experiment. Little Peter's fear was intentionally induced, and while the experiment worked, it raised questions about the potential long-term psychological impact on a child subjected to such manipulations. In modern psychology, counter-conditioning is still a valuable tool, particularly in treating phobias, but it's done with more careful consideration of ethics and the well-being of the participant. The Little Peter experiment remains a key example of how behaviorism, and more broadly, psychology, was beginning to shape human experiences, particularly with regard to emotional regulation. It serves as a reminder of the power of conditioning in influencing behavior and emotions. The Hawthorne Effect. The Hawthorne effect refers to the psychological phenomenon where people alter their behavior when they are aware that they are being observed. This effect was identified during a series of studies conducted at the Western Electric Hawthorne Works in Chicago between 1924 and 1932. The initial objective of the studies was to determine how changes in working conditions, such as lighting levels, affected workers' productivity. However, what the researchers discovered was both unexpected and deeply unsettling. No matter what changes were made to the working conditions, workers' productivity always improved simply because they were aware that they were being watched. In one phase of the experiment, the lighting in the factory was dimmed, and in another, it was brightened. The workers' performance improved regardless of the change in lighting. This led the researchers to conclude that the attention given to the workers and the knowledge that they were being observed was the primary factor motivating them to work harder. The dark side of the Hawthorne effect lies in its implications for human behavior. It suggests that when people are under observation, they may alter their behavior in ways that may not be consistent with their usual patterns, essentially creating a false sense of improvement. This has profound consequences in settings like the workplace, where performance evaluations can lead to altered behaviors that don't reflect true productivity or well being. Furthermore, it raises questions about privacy, authenticity, and individual agency. How much of what we do is influenced by external surveillance, and to what extent does this affect our true behavior and decision making? The Hawthorne effect highlights the fragility of human behavior when placed under scrutiny and how individuals react to the knowledge that they are being observed. The Zimbardo Mock Prison Experiment, the Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by Philip Zimbardo in 1971, is often hailed as one of the most disturbing psychological studies ever performed. The experiment was designed to examine the psychological effects of perceived power and how individuals behave when placed in situations of authority or submission. Zimbardo wanted to see how people would adapt to roles of guards and prisoners in a simulated prison environment. What started as a 2-week experiment was abruptly ended after just 6 days because of the extreme psychological and physical abuse that occurred. Zimbardo assigned 24 participants to randomly take on the role of either a guard or a prisoner in a mock prison set up in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford University. The guards, dressed in military style uniforms, were given significant power and authority over the prisoners, who were made to wear smocks, assigned numbers, and subjected to degrading treatment. The results were horrifying. The guards, who were initially instructed to maintain order, quickly became sadistic, subjecting the prisoners to verbal and physical abuse. The prisoners, on the other hand, began to internalize their helplessness and developed severe emotional distress. Some prisoners were subjected to extreme psychological breakdowns and needed to be removed from the experiment early. Zimbardo, who was also acting as the prison superintendent, became so involved in the study that he failed to intervene when the situation escalated. The darkest aspect of this experiment is the profound dehumanization that occurred on both sides of the prison dynamic. It revealed how quickly people can adopt brutal roles when given power, and how easily individuals can lose their sense of morality and empathy when immersed in environments where power and submission are so clearly defined. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains a powerful example of social psychology and the dangerous potential of power. It teaches us about the fragility of human morality and the corrupting influence of power. It also questions the ethics of psychological research that places participants in extreme situations for the sake of study, showing how research can sometimes become a breeding ground for harm. The Skinner Box Experiment. The Skinner Box, created by psychologist B.F. Skinner in the 1930s, is a classic example of operant conditioning, a form of learning where behavior is controlled by consequences. Skinner used the box to study the behavior of animals, mainly rats and pigeons, by observing how they responded to different stimuli, such as food rewards or electric shocks. The Skinner box was a controlled environment that allowed Skinner to manipulate variables and observe animal behavior. Inside the box, animals could press a lever to receive a food reward, a pellet of food, or they could be exposed to mild electric shocks as a form of punishment. Skinner used these rewards and punishments to analyze how the animal's behavior changed over time, leading to the development of the theory of reinforcement. Skinner's experiment demonstrated the power of reinforcement in shaping behavior. He found that animals could learn to perform specific tasks, like pressing a lever or pecking a button, when the behaviors were rewarded consistently. Positive reinforcement, providing rewards for desired behaviors, made it more likely for animals to repeat those behaviors, while negative reinforcement, removing unpleasant stimuli, also encouraged certain behaviors. The dark side of the Skinner box lies in how the control of behavior can be manipulated. Skinner believed that behavior could be shaped and controlled in much the same way that we train animals, and by extension, humans. His work has had profound implications on fields like education, advertising, and psychotherapy, where reinforcement techniques are used to modify human behavior. While Skinner's intentions were scientific, it raises ethical concerns about how much control we can exert over individuals' actions and whether this leads to a loss of personal autonomy. The Skinner box remains a powerful metaphor for how controlled environments can influence behavior and how rewards and punishments can be used as tools to shape responses. The dark potential of this conditioning is the question of how much control we, as individuals or societies, are willing to accept in exchange for desired behaviors. The Rosenthal-Jacobson study, Pygmalion effect. The Pygmalion effect, also known as the Rosenthal-Jacobson study, was conducted by Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson in 1968. This study demonstrated the power of expectations and how they can shape the performance of individuals. The central idea of the Pygmalion effect is that higher expectations lead to an increase in performance. In the study, Rosenthal and Jacobson conducted an experiment in an elementary school, telling teachers that certain students were likely to experience an intellectual growth spurt during the year. These students were randomly chosen and were not any different from the rest of the class academically. The teachers, believing that these students were gifted, treated them differently, giving them more attention, encouragement, and support. At the end of the year, the students who were labeled as high potential showed significant improvement in their academic performance. The study illustrated that teacher expectations could influence students' behavior and achievement, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. When teachers expected more from certain students, they unknowingly provided the support and encouragement needed to help those students succeed. The dark side of the Pygmalion effect is that it shows how expectations can influence human behavior, for better or worse. If a child is labeled as trouble or slow, that label can shape their behavior and performance regardless of their true potential. The study highlights how important it is to ensure that expectations are positive and equally distributed, because negative labels and biased expectations can have long-term effects on individuals' self-esteem and opportunities. The brainwashing experiments. In the 1950s, during the Cold War era, one of the most controversial and disturbing series of psychological experiments unfolded, shrouded in secrecy and driven by government interests. These experiments, famously part of the CIA's MKUltra program, aimed to explore ways to manipulate and control the human mind. The experiments would leave an indelible mark on psychological research, revealing how deeply the mind could be shaped or even broken under certain conditions. The primary focus of these experiments was to explore mind control techniques, which were believed to have applications for espionage, interrogation, and military purposes. The CIA wanted to find ways to extract information from people or manipulate their behavior without them being aware of it. To achieve this, they employed LSD, a potent psychedelic, as a mind-altering drug to see how it could be used to break down a person's will and render them more susceptible to suggestion. The experiments were often conducted on unsuspecting subjects, with some individuals unknowingly administered LSD for days at a time. The subjects would be subjected to hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological stress, all in an attempt to crack their defenses and see how easily their minds could be shaped. The darker side of this experiment is the complete disregard for consent. Many of the participants, including soldiers, students, and mental health patients, had no idea that they were being used as guinea pigs for such invasive psychological tests. For those involved, the results were often traumatic. Some suffered lasting psychological harm, including paranoia, hallucinations, and emotional breakdowns. These experiments also extended beyond LSD. They involved other mind altering substances like mescaline and techniques such as electroshock therapy and psychic driving, which sought to completely reshape a person's identity and behavior. The MKUltra program remained secret for years before it was exposed to the public, leading to widespread outrage and calls for accountability. The question remains, though, about the moral boundaries of psychological research. How much control can we exercise over the human mind, and at what cost? The darkness of these experiments lies in the ethical implications of manipulating human cognition in the name of national security. This stark reminder of the potential for psychological abuse under the guise of research resonates even today, cautioning us to question authority and always consider the human cost of scientific inquiry. The baby in the box experiment in the 1960s, Harry Harlow, a renowned psychologist, conducted one of the most emotionally disturbing experiments in psychology, one that would forever change our understanding of human attachment and the consequences of emotional deprivation. Known as the baby in the box experiment, Harlow sought to explore the importance of comfort and contact in early development, particularly in primates. However, what unfolded was a tragic reminder of how psychological harm can be inflicted in the pursuit of knowledge. Harlow worked with infant rhesus monkeys, an animal often used in psychological research due to their similarities to humans. In this study, the infant monkeys were placed in small, isolated cages, cut off from the world outside, and subjected to extreme levels of sensory deprivation. The goal was to observe how lack of social interaction and emotional warmth affected the development of attachment. Harlow also created two surrogate mothers for the babies, one made of wire that provided food, and one made of soft cloth but offered no nourishment. What Harlow discovered was both profound and deeply unsettling. The infant monkeys, when given the choice, clung to the soft cloth mother, seeking comfort and security even though the wire mother provided food. The babies would only venture to the wire mother to feed and quickly return to the cloth mother for emotional reassurance. This reinforced the idea that comfort, affection, and emotional warmth were critical for the healthy development of attachment, far more than simple physical needs like food. However, the most disturbing aspect of Harlow's experiment was the psychological toll that complete isolation had on the monkeys. When isolated for long periods, the monkeys became psychologically disturbed. They exhibited signs of anxiety, depression, and self destructive behaviors like rocking back and forth or biting themselves. These behaviors continued into adulthood, where the isolated monkeys struggled to engage in normal social interactions, and many failed to develop healthy relationships when they matured. Harlow's experiment left a dark mark on the field of psychology. While it provided valuable insights into the role of contact comfort in emotional development, it also raised ethical questions that still resonate today. The damage done to those monkeys was irreversible, and it serves as a haunting reminder of the psychological cost of using animals in research. The experiment is a cautionary tale about the balance between scientific inquiry and the responsibility we must take for the well being of the creatures we use in our studies. The shocking love experiment. Unlike many of the other experiments we've explored, the shocking love experiment carried out in 2000 by psychologists Arthur and Elaine Aron was an attempt to understand the role of vulnerability in human connection. However, the method employed by the researchers was somewhat controversial, as it involved creating intense emotional intimacy between two strangers in a controlled setting, a process that could leave lasting emotional effects. The experiment's premise was simple but intriguing. Could intimacy be accelerated by asking two people to engage in a series of deeply personal and vulnerable questions? The Aaron's experiment involved 36 questions, which ranged from lighthearted to intensely personal. The questions asked participants to share everything from childhood memories to deeply held fears and desires. The goal was to create an emotional bond by fostering deep personal sharing in a short amount of time. What was unexpected about this experiment was the intensity of the emotional connection that was created between participants. By sharing deeply personal thoughts, fears, and feelings, the strangers felt intensely bonded by the end of the experiment. In fact, the research demonstrated that such vulnerable conversations could lead to strong feelings of romantic attraction. But what's most disturbing about the shocking love experiment is that the vulnerability induced through these questions could be artificial, manipulated in a controlled setting with no guarantee that the connection would survive once the experiment was over. This raises questions about the authenticity of the bond and whether emotional intimacy can be manipulated so quickly. Could emotional closeness lead to false feelings of love if the circumstances are engineered? The intensity of the emotional connection felt by the participants is compelling, but also leaves us questioning whether it's ethical to create intimacy so rapidly and artificially. The shocking love experiment is a fascinating look at how vulnerability plays a role in our relationships, but it also reminds us of the potential dangers of manipulating human emotions for the sake of research. The Sleep Deprivation Study, 1950s and 1970s. The effects of sleep deprivation have been studied for decades, and the findings from experiments conducted between the 1950s and 1970s have revealed the profound impact that sleep, or the lack of it, can have on the human mind and body. Sleep deprivation studies, while providing valuable insights into the body's natural rhythms, also demonstrated how quickly a person can be pushed to their breaking point when sleep is withheld. In one of the most infamous studies from the 1950s, researchers subjected participants to extreme levels of sleep deprivation to see how it would affect their cognitive performance and physical well being. Some subjects were kept awake for as long as 11 days, with no more than brief naps allowed. What the researchers found was startling. As the hours without sleep stretched into days, the participants began to experience severe cognitive deterioration. Their memories faltered, their decision making became impaired, and they exhibited signs of severe psychological distress. As the sleep deprivation continued, the subjects started to experience hallucinations, delirium, and disorientation. Their emotional regulation was also compromised, and many subjects reported feeling anxious, paranoid, and irritable. The physical toll of sleep deprivation was equally troubling. The immune system of the participants was weakened, and their physical coordination began to deteriorate, leading to a sense of bodily fatigue and sickness. What makes these studies particularly disturbing is the psychological toll they took on the participants. Sleep is one of the most fundamental biological processes, and depriving the body of it for extended periods caused extreme distress. Even the most basic of cognitive functions, such as memory and attention, were severely impaired. The long term psychological consequences of sleep deprivation can linger, leaving individuals with mood disorders and cognitive impairments long after they've recovered from the lack of sleep. These studies serve as a reminder of how essential rest and sleep are for maintaining mental health and the dangers of pushing the human body and mind beyond their natural limits. While the findings contributed to understanding how sleep affects the brain, they also raised ethical concerns about the extent to which human subjects should be subjected to extreme deprivation for the sake of research. The monkey drug trials, 1960s. In the 1960s, a deeply unsettling series of experiments were carried out by Harold D. Kay and his colleagues, known as the monkey drug trials. The goal of the study was to examine the physiological and behavioral effects of drug addiction, particularly barbiturates and morphine, by observing rhesus monkeys in a controlled environment. The monkeys were isolated in cages where they were given free access to a variety of psychoactive substances such as heroin, cocaine, and alcohol. The researchers observed how these substances influenced the monkeys' behavior, noting the alterations in their motor skills, emotional regulation, and decision making abilities. The monkeys would often become addicted to the drugs and would engage in compulsive, repetitive behaviors such as self administration, ignoring food and basic needs in favor of continued drug intake. What makes this experiment so disturbing is the ethical violation at the core of the study. The monkeys, like any sentient beings, were subjected to psychological and physical harm in the name of research. The extreme behaviors exhibited by the monkeys, their withdrawal symptoms, loss of control, and inability to self regulate, served as a stark reminder of the devastating effects of addiction. The monkey drug trials aimed to study addiction, but the dark reality of these experiments was that it used sentient beings as mere test subjects, showing the deep psychological toll addiction can take on individuals. Although the research contributed to a greater understanding of drug dependency and its consequences, the treatment of the monkeys raised serious ethical concerns about the limits of animal research. The study also prompted a much needed debate about the use of animals in psychological experiments, reminding us of the moral responsibility that researchers must take when conducting studies that cause harm to living beings. The Stereotype Threat Experiment in 1995, Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson conducted one of the most insightful yet unsettling psychological studies known as the Stereotype Threat Experiment. This study was designed to explore the impact of stereotypes on performance, particularly focusing on how negative stereotypes related to race and gender could undermine an individual's ability to perform well in academic and cognitive tasks. The experiment was built around a simple premise. Participants were asked to take a difficult test that required critical thinking and problem solving skills. However, before taking the test, they were subtly exposed to stereotypes related to their group identity. For example, African American students were told that the test was a measure of their intellectual ability, while women were reminded of the stereotype that women typically perform worse on math and science tests compared to men. What the researchers discovered was both profound and disturbing. Participants who were exposed to these negative stereotypes performed significantly worse on the test than those who were not. The stereotype threat, the fear of confirming a negative stereotype about one's social group, had a direct and measurable impact on performance. Even individuals who did not consciously believe in the stereotype still experienced a drop in performance when they were reminded of it. This experiment revealed just how deeply ingrained stereotypes can affect performance and self confidence, even if the individual is not consciously aware of it. The dark truth exposed by this study was the extent to which external pressures and the internalization of societal stereotypes can limit people's potential. Even highly capable individuals may falter when they are reminded of stereotypes that they know society holds about them. This phenomenon is a powerful example of how societal expectations can diminish self-worth and hinder achievement. The stereotype threat experiment raised critical questions about how we view ourselves and how we respond to societal pressures. It also served as a wake-up call about the harm done by negative societal labels and the psychological toll they take on marginalized groups. The Phantom Limb Experiment in 2004, V.S. Ramachandran and his team conducted a groundbreaking study on the phenomenon known as phantom limb pain, where individuals who had their limbs amputated still experience the sensation of the missing limb. The phantom limb experiment focused on understanding how the brain processes sensation and how the mind continues to register pain even after the physical body has changed. The experiment involved patients who had lost a limb, often through trauma, and yet reported experiencing pain or the sensation of their lost limb. The researchers used a technique called mirror therapy, where the amputee would place their remaining limb in front of a mirror and move it, creating the illusion that the missing limb was still intact and moving in front of them. What was astonishing was that many patients reported a reduction in pain after several sessions of using the mirror therapy, as their brain was retrained to recognize the phantom limb as no longer existing. The brain's plasticity, its ability to reorganize itself after an injury, was found to be far more complex than scientists had previously understood. What makes the phantom limb experiment so fascinating and disturbing is how the brain can fool itself into feeling sensations that are no longer physically possible. The pain that these individuals felt was not related to tissue damage, but to the brain's attempt to make sense of the missing limb. This created a paradox. The limb was gone, yet the brain continued to register pain, showing how deeply and unpredictably the mind can affect our physical experience. This experiment sheds light on the deep connection between the mind and body, and how psychological and neurological processes can manifest in physical pain. It also reminds us of the mystery and complexity of the human brain, how it can continue to create sensations long after the cause has disappeared. In this sense, the phantom limb experiment illustrates the powerful role the brain plays in our perception of reality. The gender role experiment. In the 1990s, psychologist Sandra Bem conducted a groundbreaking experiment that would challenge long held assumptions about gender roles. Bem's gender role experiment sought to explore how much of gender behavior is socially constructed rather than biologically determined. This experiment provided valuable insights into how rigid gender norms shape human behavior from a young age. The experiment involved observing children, both male and female, and their interactions with gender specific toys, such as dolls for girls and trucks for boys. Bem also studied the behavior of children when they were not exposed to traditional gender roles. In the study, children were asked to play with toys that were considered gender neutral, such as blocks or puzzles, and were then observed in their natural play environment to see how they behaved when their actions were not shaped by gendered expectations. The findings were disturbing in their implications. Children, even at very young ages, were strongly influenced by societal norms about what was considered appropriate for their gender. Girls played with dolls and kitchen sets, while boys played with trucks and action figures, even when given the opportunity to explore gender neutral options. In many cases, when boys were seen playing with dolls or girls with trucks, they were criticized or discouraged by peers and adults. This experiment revealed how early the conditioning of gender roles begins and how deeply entrenched these expectations are in society. The psychological impact of these rigid gender roles was significant. Children who defied traditional roles were often subjected to ridicule and social isolation. This highlighted how much our identity is shaped by societal expectations and how these roles can limit personal expression and freedom. The dark reality of the gender role experiment is that gender norms are not simply biological or innate, but are shaped and reinforced by the world around us. The experiment showed how social pressure can limit an individual's potential and creativity, forcing them to fit into predefined boxes. It also raised important questions about the harmful effects of gender stereotyping and how it impacts the development of identity throughout life. The false memory experiment. In the 1990s, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus was at the forefront of uncovering one of the most disturbing aspects of human memory: the ease with which we can be led to believe false memories. Loftus's false memory experiment sought to examine how memories could be implanted in a person's mind, making them believe they had experienced events that had never actually occurred. The experiment began with Loftus showing participants a set of genuine memories they had from childhood, events like family vacations or outings to a local park. Alongside these real memories, Loftus introduced one false memory, which was fabricated by the researchers. This false memory typically involved something relatively simple, like getting lost in a shopping mall. Loftus would suggest this memory to participants by providing small, seemingly plausible details, like the feeling of fear or the confusion they might have felt as a child in such a situation. The astonishing part of the experiment was how easily participants fell into believing these fabricated memories. After hearing the suggestion and being subtly prompted to remember more details about the false event, many participants began to describe the scene in vivid detail. They believed they had been lost in the mall, even though they had no recollection of it before. As they spoke about the fabricated event, they added more details to the story, things like the clothes they were wearing or the people they might have been with, details that weren't part of the original suggestion. What makes the false memory experiment so unsettling is the fact that people can be made to misremember something that never happened and fully integrate this false memory into their personal recollections. This fragility of memory exposes a darker side of human cognition. Our memories are not as reliable as we think they are. Memories, it turns out, are not static recordings of events, but are constantly malleable, changing with time and influence. Loftus's findings had profound implications in the realm of eyewitness testimony. If the human mind can be so easily manipulated, can we truly trust what we remember? In legal contexts, such as trials, the power of suggestion can lead to false convictions based on distorted memories. Loftus's work raised critical questions about the ethical boundaries of influencing memory, as it illustrated how easily someone can reconstruct their past in a way that suits external narratives or pressures. The Stockholm Syndrome Experiment. In the 1970s, a psychological phenomenon that would come to be known as Stockholm Syndrome began to gain widespread attention. The term originated after a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1973, when hostages, who had been held captive for several days, began to form emotional bonds with their captors. This strange emotional connection led psychologists to ask, how can individuals who are terrified and vulnerable develop such strong feelings for those who are causing them harm? The case that gave birth to the term Stockholm Syndrome involved four hostages who were held in a bank vault by criminals during a 6-day standoff. The robbers, armed with guns and explosives, initially instilled deep fear in the hostages, who had no idea whether they would make it out alive. But over the course of their captivity, something unexpected began to happen. The hostages started to identify with and even defend their captors, some of whom showed them moments of kindness, offering food and conversation during their confinement. The hostages began to feel sympathy for their captors, a bond that seemed to contradict their initial terror. They began to rationalize the captors' behavior, even advocating for them once the standoff ended. This emotional shift perplexed both the police and psychologists, and it was soon clear that the psychological toll of captivity had triggered a survival mechanism in the hostages, forming an emotional attachment to the captors as a way of coping with fear and gaining some sense of control. Psychologists later came to understand that Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological response to extreme stress, where the victim begins to perceive their captor as a protector or even as a source of safety. In some cases, hostages feel a deep sense of gratitude for small acts of kindness, no matter how minimal, and these feelings can morph into genuine loyalty or affection. The dark side of this phenomenon is the lasting psychological damage it can cause. The bonds that are formed under such extreme stress can prevent victims from leaving abusive or dangerous situations. Stockholm Syndrome has been linked to abusive relationships where the victim feels trapped by the psychological manipulation of their abuser, unable to escape even when the danger becomes evident. It shows how vulnerability can be exploited by those in power and how emotional trauma can lead to a distorted sense of reality. The Car Crash Study. The car crash study, conducted in the early 2000s by psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, is an example of how language can shape our perception of reality and even distort our memories. The study was designed to examine how wording and suggestion can influence people's recollections of events, particularly in the context of traumatic situations like car accidents. Participants in the study were shown videos of car accidents, some severe and others relatively minor. After viewing the videos, the participants were asked questions about the events they had just witnessed. The most alarming aspect of the study was how the language used in the questions affected the participants' memories of the accidents. For instance, one group of participants was asked, "How fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other?" Another group was asked the same question, but with the word hit replacing smashed. What Loftus discovered was that the participants who heard the word smashed estimated the speed of the cars to be significantly higher than those who heard hit. Furthermore, those who were asked the question with the word smashed were more likely to later report seeing broken glass at the scene, glass that was never present in the video. What's deeply disturbing about Loftus's findings is the power of suggestion, how a simple change in wording can completely alter a person's perception of an event. The car crash study illustrated that memory is not a static recording of events, but is shaped by external influences. It shows that when people are questioned about traumatic events, their memories can be manipulated through language, causing them to believe things that never happened. The ethical concerns of this study are profound, particularly in the context of the criminal justice system, where eyewitness testimony can be influenced by subtle cues and manipulations. It raises serious questions about how we trust the accuracy of memories and how language can be used to shape or distort reality. The Forced Normality Study. In the 1940s, a deeply controversial experiment known as the Forced Normality Study was conducted by psychologist Kurt Lewin and his colleagues, focusing on the manipulation of individual behavior within a group context. The goal of the study was to examine how social norms and group pressures could force individuals to conform to society's expectations, even if those expectations were unnatural or uncomfortable. The study began by selecting a small group of volunteers from a community and placing them in a controlled environment where they were tasked with behaving in a conventionally normal manner, despite being presented with non traditional or even psychologically conflicting scenarios. For example, participants were encouraged to act like ideal citizens, follow societal rules, and suppress any behaviors that might be seen as abnormal. Yet, as the experiment progressed, the group was presented with increasing social pressures, small incidents of public shaming, exclusion, and peer pressure situations designed to test their conformity. The findings were both fascinating and unsettling. It became evident that individuals were often more willing to conform to social norms and suppress their authentic selves than to stand out or reject societal expectations. The forced adherence to normal behaviors was so strong that some participants experienced psychological distress, loss of identity, anxiety, and alienation from their true selves as they struggled to fit into the mold of what society expected. Groupthink, the desire for approval from others, became a central theme in the study. The darkness of the forced normality study lies in the deep psychological costs associated with conformity. It exposed how fragile our sense of self can be when subjected to societal pressures and how easily people can lose touch with their authentic identities. The study highlighted the mental strain that results from forcing individuals into rigid norms, especially when those norms are far removed from their true feelings or individual desires. This experiment offers a chilling insight into the power of social conformity and the psychological toll it can take. It reminds us of the human cost of adhering to rigid societal expectations, showing how the pursuit of normalcy can sometimes strip away individuality and cause emotional harm. The Ulrich-Neisser Perception Study. In the 1970s, Ulrich Neisser, a renowned cognitive psychologist, conducted a groundbreaking study on the human perception of reality, which would later come to be known as the Ulrich-Neisser Perception Study. Neisser wanted to understand how the brain processes and filters sensory information and whether the mind constructs perceptions of the world based on its expectations and past experiences. The study involved participants watching a video of a basketball game where players passed a ball among themselves. Neisser's team asked participants to focus on certain aspects of the game, like the number of passes made by one team. However, the study took a surprising turn when midway through the video, a person in a gorilla suit walked across the screen. After watching the video, participants were asked if they had noticed the gorilla. Astonishingly, a significant number of people completely missed the gorilla walking across the screen, even though it was clearly visible for several seconds. Neisser's study revealed a phenomenon known as inattentional blindness, where individuals fail to notice unexpected stimuli when their attention is focused on something else. This experiment highlighted how our perception of reality is not a perfect reflection of the world around us, but is instead heavily influenced by what we choose to focus on or expect to see. It suggests that the brain's attention is like a filter, sifting through incoming information and ignoring anything that doesn't align with our preconceptions. What makes the Ulrich Neisser perception study particularly dark is its revelation that what we see is not necessarily what is truly there. Our perceptions are shaped by expectations and biases, leading us to ignore critical details that do not fit into the mental framework we've constructed. This means that our reality is often a distorted version of the actual world, influenced by our own subjective interpretations. The ethical implication of this study is profound, as it suggests that our understanding of the world around us may not be as reliable or accurate as we think. This study challenges the very nature of reality and shows how easy it is for our brains to miss vital information. It's a haunting reminder that the mind has its limits, and we may be walking through life with a selective perception that keeps us blind to the full complexity of the world. The Face Recognition Study. In the 1990s, Bruce and Young, two cognitive psychologists, conducted the face recognition study, which would go on to have a profound impact on how we understand human perception of faces. The study's aim was to investigate how we recognize and process faces, a task that seems effortless to most people, but is far more complex than it appears. The ability to recognize faces is something fundamental to human experience, yet the process itself remains shrouded in mystery. In the study, participants were shown photos of faces and then asked to identify individuals from the same group of faces presented in different contexts. Some faces were shown with disguises or at odd angles, while others were presented with unfamiliar emotional expressions. What the researchers discovered was fascinating. The brain processes faces in a highly specialized way. Some regions of the brain are activated exclusively for the task of recognizing faces, and we rely on subtle facial cues, such as the spacing of eyes or the shape of the mouth, to make quick judgments. However, the dark side of this study lies in the discovery that our ability to recognize faces is heavily influenced by familiarity and context. People have more difficulty recognizing faces when they are presented outside of the context in which they are most familiar, such as seeing someone in a new setting with a different expression or after they've aged. The study revealed that our brain relies on assumptions about familiarity to process faces quickly, but those assumptions can sometimes be incorrect, leading to errors in identification. The face recognition study raised critical questions about the accuracy and biases in facial recognition. It is both unsettling and powerful to consider how we often misjudge others based on superficial cues, such as emotion or context, and how our brains can fail to recognize individuals under certain circumstances. The ethical concern here is the potential for misidentification in high stakes situations like law enforcement or criminal justice, where the ability to accurately recognize a face can carry life altering consequences. The Monkey Love Experiment. The Monkey Love Experiment, conducted by Harry Harlow in the 1950s, is perhaps one of the most emotionally intense and ethically questionable psychological studies in history. Harlow, seeking to better understand the nature of attachment, conducted an experiment with infant rhesus monkeys to test the emotional bond between mother and child. This experiment would ultimately lead to profound insights about the importance of love, comfort, and emotional connection in infant development. In the experiment, Harlow separated infant monkeys from their biological mothers shortly after birth and placed them in isolation with two surrogate mothers, one made of wire that provided food, and another made of soft cloth but offered no food. The purpose was to see whether the infant monkeys would prefer to stay with the wire mother, who provided nourishment, or the cloth mother, which offered no sustenance but comfort and warmth. The results were heartbreaking and profoundly revealing. The monkeys overwhelmingly chose the soft cloth mother, clinging to it for comfort and security, even though it didn't provide food. The babies would only approach the wire mother to feed, then quickly return to the cloth mother for emotional reassurance. The study conclusively demonstrated that contact comfort and the emotional bond with a caregiver are far more important than physical nourishment for healthy development. However, Harlow's experiment took a darker turn when he introduced complete isolation into the study. Some of the infant monkeys were kept alone in barren cages, completely deprived of social interaction or any form of maternal care. The psychological toll was devastating. The isolated monkeys exhibited extreme signs of distress, including rocking, biting, and self harming behaviors. These monkeys grew up to be unable to form normal social relationships, unable to properly interact with other monkeys, and often remained emotionally distant for the rest of their lives. Harlow's work, while instrumental in demonstrating the importance of love and comfort in infant development, also raised grave ethical concerns. The deep emotional suffering imposed on these animals, who were denied the basic right to comfort and emotional bonding, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of psychological research. The induced anxiety experiment. In the 1980s, psychologist Donald Meichenbaum conducted a series of studies on anxiety, focusing on how stress and anxiety could be induced and then controlled. His goal was to explore the underlying psychological processes that trigger anxiety in individuals and how these triggers could be managed or alleviated. The experiment would provide insights into the cognitive and emotional responses of individuals when they were placed under controlled psychological stress. The study began by inducing anxiety in participants through a variety of methods, ranging from performance pressure, such as asking participants to complete challenging tasks in a limited time, to more emotional triggers, like presenting them with disturbing or traumatic stimuli. Participants were exposed to simulated situations designed to elicit fear and anxiety, and their responses were carefully observed. Some of the triggers included exposing participants to realistic portrayals of danger or even involving them in interviews where they were asked to speak about their deepest fears. The findings were deeply revealing. Anxiety is not merely a reaction to external stress, but rather a complex emotional response influenced by both cognitive perception and physical arousal. The study showed that anxiety could be induced in individuals even in the absence of real threats, simply by priming them with negative stimuli or by placing them in stressful but safe environments. What was even more striking was how cognitive framing could drastically change the intensity of anxiety. Those who were able to reframe the anxiety inducing stimuli, such as reminding themselves that the situations were not real or that they were safe, had much lower anxiety levels than those who perceived the stimuli as threatening. While the study provided important insights into the mechanisms of anxiety, the ethical implications were significant. The participants were deliberately subjected to stress and anxiety in ways that were potentially damaging to their mental health. Though they were debriefed after the study, the experiment showed how deliberate anxiety induction can be emotionally taxing, especially if the individual lacks the tools to manage the feelings of helplessness that often accompany anxiety. The dark side of the induced anxiety experiment lies in the psychological toll of intentionally creating anxiety. It reminded us of the fragility of the human mind and how easily our emotions can be manipulated when placed under controlled conditions. Anxiety, though a natural response, can be exacerbated by external forces, and this study provided a sobering look at how easily individuals could be pushed into psychological distress. Despite its positive contributions to anxiety management research, the experiment raised important ethical questions. What limits should there be when manipulating people's emotions, even for the sake of research? How much psychological harm is acceptable in the pursuit of knowledge about the human mind? These questions still resonate in modern psychological research. The Hunger and Deprivation Study. The Hunger and Deprivation Study, conducted in the 1960s by psychologist A. Maslow and his colleagues, sought to understand the effects of food deprivation on both the physical body and the mind. This experiment explored the psychological and emotional responses of individuals who were subjected to long periods of hunger, and it became one of the most influential studies in understanding the relationship between basic needs and mental health. Participants in the study were volunteers who willingly participated in the hunger deprivation experiment. For several weeks, these individuals were put on a strict diet, with their caloric intake significantly reduced to the point where they were living on minimal food rations. The experiment was designed to observe the psychological changes that occurred in response to hunger. Participants were observed in a controlled environment where they were given minimal food and encouraged to focus on physical and psychological tasks, even as their energy levels and mood began to deteriorate. The findings were both shocking and profound. As the participants went through the weeks of hunger, they exhibited increasing levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. The physical effects of hunger were evident, with participants displaying weight loss, fatigue, and muscle weakness. But what was particularly revealing was how hunger began to affect their mental faculties. Participants became obsessed with food, and their thoughts and discussions were centered almost entirely on the idea of eating. Cognitive impairment occurred as a result of the lack of energy, and many participants struggled to focus on tasks unrelated to food. More disturbingly, the psychological impacts were not just short term. The deprivation caused lasting emotional changes that continued even after participants were given full meals. Binge eating, feelings of guilt, and depression were common as participants struggled to regain a sense of normalcy after being deprived for so long. The dark side of the hunger and deprivation study is the profound mental health toll that hunger and deprivation can take. The experiment illustrated that basic human needs, like food and sustenance, are not just physical necessities, they are intricately tied to emotional well being. The study provided evidence that prolonged deprivation can distort reality, affect mood, and lead to chronic psychological trauma. The ethical implications are deeply troubling. The study raised concerns about the limits of human suffering in the name of science. Though the participants agreed to participate, the emotional cost of subjecting people to hunger for research purposes remains a dark chapter in psychological research. The ethical questions raised by this experiment continue to resonate. How much suffering is acceptable in the name of knowledge? Should we, as researchers, ever subject people to the extreme emotional and physical consequences of hunger, even if the results can lead to important insights? The social conformity experiment. In the 1950s, one of the most famous psychological experiments on social influence was conducted by Solomon Asch, the social conformity experiment. This study sought to understand the extent to which individuals would conform to the opinions of others, even when those opinions were clearly incorrect. Ash's experiment would shine a light on the power of group influence and reveal just how easily people can be swayed to go along with a collective view, even at the expense of their own perceptions and beliefs. Participants were placed in groups and asked to engage in a simple task, matching line lengths on a card. The catch was that everyone in the group, except for the participant, was in on the experiment, and they were instructed to give incorrect answers. The participant, who believed they were part of a real group, was the only one whose response was not predetermined. Ash wanted to see if the individual would conform to the clearly wrong answers of the group, or if they would trust their own perception of the lines. The findings were startling. A large proportion of participants, around 75%, conformed to the incorrect answers given by the group, even though they knew the answers were wrong. The pressure to conform to the group was overwhelming, and many participants reported feeling a sense of discomfort or anxiety when they deviated from the group's opinion. This experiment showed how easily peer pressure and the desire for social acceptance can override an individual's own judgment, even when the facts are clear. The dark side of the social conformity experiment lies in how much individuals are willing to suppress their own beliefs and conform to the opinions of others in order to fit in. Ash's study reveals the psychological cost of conformity, the loss of individuality, the fear of social rejection, and the mental strain of trying to fit in with the group. It also raised important ethical questions about the psychological impact of social pressure, showing just how easily human beings can be influenced by group norms. The ethical implications of this experiment involve the psychological discomfort experienced by participants who were forced to conform to an incorrect opinion. Though participants were debriefed after the study, the experiment underscores the power of social pressure and how it can cause people to doubt their own perceptions in favor of group norms. The Abuse of Psychiatric Patients Study. The Abuse of Psychiatric Patients Study, conducted in the 1960s, is one of the most disturbing studies in the history of psychology, as it explored the dehumanizing conditions and psychological abuse faced by psychiatric patients in mental institutions. This study was designed to explore the effects of institutionalization and the power dynamics between patients and caregivers in psychiatric settings. The researchers were particularly interested in how patients were treated and whether the systemic abuse of individuals in psychiatric care was a result of institutional culture or a broader issue in mental health treatment. The study involved observing patients in a psychiatric hospital, focusing on how they were treated by both medical staff and other patients. The researchers found that many patients were subjected to involuntary treatment, including the use of restraints, medication, and isolation. The conditions were often inhumane, and patients were treated as objects rather than human beings. The researchers documented instances of abuse where patients were physically restrained, denied food, and sometimes subjected to harsh psychiatric treatments designed to control rather than treat their conditions. What made this study so chilling was the realization that dehumanization and psychological abuse were embedded in the very structure of psychiatric care. It revealed how institutional systems could foster environments where patients were treated with disrespect, their personal autonomy stripped away. These inhumane conditions often led to long term psychological trauma for the patients, who were made to feel as though they had no value outside of their diagnosis. The study highlighted the systemic abuse that many patients endured, shedding light on the dark realities of psychiatric institutions in that era. The ethical concerns of this study are deeply troubling. It called attention to the need for reform in mental health care and emphasized the importance of ensuring that patients' dignity, humanity, and rights are respected. It also raised critical questions about the power dynamics between patients and medical professionals and how easily these dynamics can be exploited. The psychological damage caused by such institutional abuse was profound, leaving many individuals with long-term scars that affected their ability to trust medical professionals and their own sense of self-worth. The Forced Sexuality Experiment, 1980s. In the 1980s, the Forced Sexuality Experiment was a study that delved into the complexities of sexual behavior, identity, and social pressure. The focus of the study was to examine how external forces, including psychological coercion and societal expectations, could potentially shape or even alter a person's sexual identity and preferences. While this experiment was designed to help understand human sexuality, the methods employed would raise profound ethical questions and reveal unsettling truths about the manipulation of deeply personal aspects of identity. Participants in the study were individuals who were recruited under the guise of behavioral research. These were often college students, young adults, and sometimes individuals from vulnerable populations who were not fully aware of the emotional or psychological manipulation they would undergo. The experiment typically began with a pre screening session where participants were asked about their sexual preferences, desires, and experiences. The researchers then presented scenarios in which participants were subjected to explicit sexual stimuli that were either outside of their preference or included forced exposure to various sexual behaviors, including interactions with individuals of different genders or orientations. The study's manipulation wasn't limited to just sexual exposure. Researchers would subtly encourage participants to engage in sexual acts that contradicted their sexual orientation or comfort zone. These acts were framed as necessary parts of the research process, creating a sense of obligation for participants to conform to these expectations. At times, the social pressure was amplified by other participants or the researchers who would use persuasive language to induce compliance. What made the forced sexuality experiment so controversial was the deep psychological harm it inflicted. Many of the participants, after the experiment, reported significant confusion, distress, and emotional trauma. Some participants experienced sexual identity crises, while others became deeply distrustful of both their own desires and their relationships with others. The forced sexual exposure created a distortion in their understanding of their own sexual identity, leading to an overwhelming sense of disorientation. The dark side of this experiment is rooted in the loss of agency. The participants were coerced into performing actions that went against their will, often under the guise of research or exploration. Their personal autonomy and sense of sexual integrity were not respected, and their emotional well being was compromised. This experiment raises serious ethical concerns about informed consent and the extent to which researchers can manipulate human desires and sexuality for the sake of understanding. It serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of human identity when subjected to external manipulation, and how easily a person's boundaries can be crossed if not held with respect. The long lasting impact of this study was the psychological distress that lingered in the lives of participants who were left questioning their own sexual boundaries and personal preferences. The ethical violations within this study led to significant reforms in how sexuality and identity research is approached today. The Language Manipulation Study. In the 1970s, cognitive psychologist George Lakoff set out to understand one of the most fascinating and powerful tools in human interaction: language. The Language Manipulation Study was an investigation into how language influences not just communication, but perception, decision making, and social behavior. Lakoff sought to determine the extent to which language shapes reality, the way we think, and the way we act in response to external stimuli. Lakoff's study involved exposing participants to differing language structures and how they could dramatically influence opinions and emotional responses. For example, a group of participants might be exposed to a scenario about a natural disaster, but the framing of the situation would change depending on the language. In one version, the event was described as a tragic event, while in another, it was presented as a preventable disaster caused by human negligence. Despite the events being described in essentially the same way, the participants' responses were drastically different depending on the language used. One of the most revealing aspects of this study was the power of framing, how the same reality can be seen in vastly different ways depending on the words used to describe it. Participants who heard the tragic event were more likely to express sympathy, while those who heard the preventable disaster were more likely to assign blame. This suggested that language didn't just describe reality, it created it. In another part of the experiment, the study explored how political language shaped public opinion. When participants were exposed to a political issue, the exact same situation was presented, but with different language depending on political biases. A policy that was presented as a social safety net was viewed favorably by most, but when labeled as a welfare handout, the public became more skeptical and even hostile to the idea. The dark side of the language manipulation study lies in how easily language can be used as a tool for manipulation. Words are not just tools for communication, but can serve as weapons that shape and distort reality, directing emotions, creating biases, and even altering behaviors. The ethical concerns surrounding this study are both profound and disturbing. The ability to manipulate individuals through language, especially in political contexts, raises serious issues about free will, autonomy, and personal responsibility. Language, when used effectively, can encourage people to make decisions or form opinions without ever being aware that they are being guided. It reminds us of the psychological power language holds over our perceptions and how our words, not just our actions, can be used to manipulate thoughts, leading us into believing falsehoods or adopting positions that we wouldn't normally hold. The Blindfolded Participant Study. The Blindfolded Participant Study, conducted in the 1980s, was a fascinating and deeply revealing exploration into how sensory deprivation and lack of visual information affect human behavior, decision making, and social dynamics. This study involved participants being blindfolded and then exposed to a range of different scenarios where vision was removed and their reactions and behaviors were carefully observed. At the start of the study, participants were asked to complete simple tasks like moving objects from one place to another or solving problems while blindfolded. These tasks required them to rely entirely on their other senses, primarily hearing and touch. As the study progressed, participants were subjected to more complex tasks where they had to navigate a labyrinth or socialize with others, still deprived of their sense of sight. What was particularly fascinating about the study was how reliance on senses other than vision created a shift in social behaviors. Participants, when interacting with each other, became more receptive and empathetic toward one another. The lack of visual cues, such as body language or facial expressions, meant that people had to rely more heavily on tone of voice and emotional context in conversations. Surprisingly, this led to stronger emotional connections and a more genuine exchange of thoughts and feelings. However, the dark side of the blindfolded participant study became apparent when individuals were forced to perform more complex cognitive tasks while deprived of vision. The participants often became disoriented, stressed, and frustrated. The lack of visual information led to feelings of helplessness and loss of control. Even simple tasks became overwhelming as participants struggled to make decisions and navigate their environment. The psychological toll of removing a person's sense of sight was immense. The participants began to feel emotionally drained as they fought to engage with a world that seemed suddenly inaccessible. The study revealed how crucial visual input is to our emotional regulation and how disorienting it can be to live in a world that doesn't allow us to see. Ethically, the blindfolded participant study raised concerns about the psychological strain caused by depriving participants of one of their most vital senses. The emotional distress faced by individuals when they were deprived of vision highlights the vulnerabilities inherent in human behavior and the need for care when manipulating a person's environment. It also raised important questions about control, how much of our behavior is shaped by external stimuli, and how reliant we are on sensory information to feel secure in our choices. The study also demonstrated the power of the mind to compensate for missing information, but the dark truth is that the human mind is fragile, and the loss of any one sense can lead to profound psychological consequences. The Abusive Parenting Study. In the 1970s, a controversial and deeply unsettling experiment was carried out to investigate the impact of abusive parenting on children's psychological development. This study aimed to explore how verbal, physical, and emotional abuse by parents affected their children's behavior, emotional stability, and overall mental health. But what emerged from the experiment was not just a revelation about the trauma caused by abuse. It also raised profound ethical concerns about the role of researchers in perpetuating harm in the name of scientific inquiry. The study began with researchers observing families in their everyday environments, particularly focusing on the interactions between parents and their children. Researchers selected families in which there was a clear pattern of abusive behavior, parents who regularly resorted to physical punishment, verbal insults, or neglect. The goal was to see how this exposure to abuse affected children's emotional and cognitive development, as well as their ability to form healthy relationships in the future. What was particularly disturbing about the study was how researchers passively observed these interactions without an intervening to protect the children. Researchers documented instances of verbal belittling, physical aggression, and emotional neglect, with little to no attempt to provide support or stop the abusive behavior. In some cases, the children were subjected to intense emotional distress, such as being shouted at, isolated from their peers, or physically harmed, all while the researchers observed and collected data. The findings were both heartbreaking and alarming. Children exposed to this type of abusive parenting exhibited signs of severe psychological damage, including anxiety, depression, aggressive behavior, and low self esteem. Many children struggled with social withdrawal, unable to trust others, and failed to form meaningful, healthy relationships with their peers. Some showed signs of learned helplessness, believing they were unworthy of love or care. What made this study so disturbing was the lack of intervention by the researchers, as well as the ethical violations that occurred by allowing the children to be subjected to emotional trauma for the sake of observation. The psychological scars that these children carried with them for the rest of their lives were immense. Some children even repeated the cycle of abuse, becoming abusive parents themselves later in life. The dark side of the abusive parenting study is rooted in the damage done in the name of research. The children involved were exposed to severe emotional harm without consent or protective intervention, raising serious ethical questions about the limits of research and whether the ends, understanding abuse, could ever justify the means of allowing children to suffer. This study ultimately helped to shift the conversation about the psychological consequences of abuse, but it also acted as a sobering reminder of the need for protection and respect for the well being of vulnerable individuals in research. It reinforced the ethical principle that researchers must never exploit human suffering for the sake of knowledge. The Social Isolation Experiment, 2000s. The Social Isolation Experiment, conducted in the early 2000s, focused on understanding the psychological and emotional impact of prolonged social isolation. With humans being deeply social creatures, the researchers wanted to understand how complete removal from society could affect a person's mental health, behavioral patterns, and ability to interact with others. Little did they know, the results of this study would highlight the devastating consequences of cutting off all social contact from individuals for extended periods of time. The experiment placed participants in isolation for weeks at a time, cutting them off from any form of human contact. The participants were deprived of communication with family or friends, no social media, and were separated from the world entirely. They were allowed basic physical needs like food, water, and shelter, but no emotional connection to the outside world. The researchers wanted to observe how humans would react when stripped of one of their most vital emotional and psychological needs, connection with others. The results were profoundly disturbing. In the initial days of isolation, participants expressed feelings of boredom and restlessness. They tried to occupy themselves with simple tasks, but the lack of meaningful social interaction left them feeling empty and disconnected. As the days passed, the effects of isolation began to show. Anxiety levels increased, and some participants became deeply depressed, unable to cope with the lack of human contact. Cognitive abilities also began to decline. Memory and focus deteriorated as isolation took its toll on the participants' mental faculties. What was most troubling about the experiment was how quickly participants began to break down mentally. Their sense of self became distorted as isolation prevented them from receiving feedback from others about their actions, thoughts, or feelings. Participants often reported feelings of despair, loneliness, and hopelessness. Some even experienced hallucinations and paranoia as their sense of reality began to slip away. The dark side of this experiment was the revelation that humans cannot survive without connection, not just physically, but psychologically. The study revealed just how deeply ingrained the need for social interaction is for emotional and cognitive health. Without it, mental well being begins to deteriorate rapidly, leading to significant psychological trauma. Ethically, the social isolation experiment raised serious concerns. How much suffering is too much in the name of research? The experiment revealed that complete isolation can cause irreparable damage to an individual's mental health, and it pushed psychologists and ethicists to rethink how vulnerable populations, especially those already at risk, should be treated in studies. This experiment underscored the human need for connection and revealed the fragility of the human psyche when left alone in a world without the emotional support of others. It served as a warning of the devastating consequences of isolation. The Hypnosis and Manipulation Study. In the 1990s, psychologists embarked on an experiment to explore the extent to which hypnosis could be used to manipulate behavior and even alter personal beliefs. The Hypnosis and Manipulation Study sought to understand how susceptible individuals were to psychological suggestion under a hypnotic state. Researchers wanted to observe whether hypnosis could be used to control a person's actions and influence their decision making without their conscious awareness. The study began by inducing a hypnotic trance in participants, using techniques to induce a deeply relaxed, suggestible state where their mind was highly receptive to external influence. Once in a trance, participants were given suggestions ranging from simple tasks like performing a harmless action to more complex behaviors, including acting out certain emotions or engaging in behavior that went against their usual tendencies. For instance, some participants were asked to believe that they were in a completely different environment, while others were told to carry out acts they would normally avoid, such as acting aggressively or even performing embarrassing tasks in front of the researchers. The results of the study were startling. Many of the participants, once under hypnosis, followed the suggestions without question. Some were able to alter their behavior dramatically, showing increased aggression, confidence, or even altered emotional responses, all while believing they were making these decisions on their own. Others followed commands to do things that they would normally find unacceptable, such as performing embarrassing acts in front of others. What made this experiment particularly dark was the realization of how easily an individual's mind could be manipulated when in a vulnerable, suggestible state. Hypnosis exposed the fragility of human agency, where external suggestions could overpower a person's conscious will, leading them to act against their natural impulses or ethical beliefs. It became clear that hypnosis could be used to exploit individuals into making decisions they would otherwise never consider. The ethical implications of this study were immense. The ability to manipulate behavior through hypnosis raised profound concerns about control and personal autonomy. If individuals could be made to do things they would never normally do, what moral boundaries exist when it comes to using hypnosis for personal gain? This raised alarms about the potential for hypnotic manipulation in therapy, advertising, and even politics. It also made researchers and ethicists question the limits of psychological influence and how far is too far in the manipulation of the human mind. Psychological well being could be undermined if suggestions during a hypnotic state were used in harmful ways, leading to an altered sense of reality and long term effects on the individual's sense of autonomy.